How you guys doing? So today we're going to continue on what we did last class, which was the Italian unification. And so today we're going to look at Germany and the German unification. And this, of course, is going to center around Prussia, who is the large German state, them competing with Austria, obviously, for this. And I think this lesson is one of my favorites. Obviously, Otto von Bismarck holds a special place in my heart just for being so awesome. As you'll see, he does a lot of things that are highly manipulative, and he does a lot of things that a lot of us would look at as kind of evil. He kind of causes all of these things to happen, and he does things behind the scenes. He manipulates messages. He fabricates reasons for war, and it works. All of it works, and that's why I labeled him the Bond villain who wins. And he's very obvious with his plan. He even does the Bond villain giveaway, right? He tells everyone what he wants to do. He wants to unify Germany, but the how is where he gets it, and that's the one thing he's going to be very close to the vest. And as we will discover with him and his realpolitik and everything else, Bismarck is a very charismatic guy. So let's get this started, and let's keep in mind, like the most basic assignment you can get off of this is a comparative type essay or analysis of German unification and Italian unification. So let's get going. You got to remember the isms. And I did this last time with Italy, and some of you joked around about it, but you have to remember the isms. And so I'll bring them up again. These are so very important because if you don't understand them, you can't fully explain the story. Conservatism. So conservatism and conservatives, Bismarck is sort of a conservative. He wants to maintain the power of the monarchy. Conservatives want to maintain the old order of Europe. And so in Prussia, what that really dealt with were the Junkers, right? The Junkers, who are those land-owning nobles like Bismarck. They want to maintain noble privilege. They do not want to give rights to the common people. They don't want to give voting rights. They don't particularly want to have too many civil liberties. And so conservatism is something that's going to be around. And the reason conservatism sticks is you have to understand, the French Revolution was so chaotic. It caused so much death, so much destruction that there was a big pushback against liberalism. And that brings us to liberalism. Liberalism is pretty basic. They wanted voting rights. They wanted the right of free speech. They wanted equality before the law. Liberals tended to want those things in particular. Now, some of those things also went into working rights, and we start to see socialism with Karl Marx and everything else. And those things all factor into it. And Bismarck is going to have battles with both conservatives and liberals. Even though he is looked at as one of the conservative politicians, he's really not, and I'll explain that in a minute. But by no means is he liberal either. And he's also not a moderate. And so that's going to be some of the things we have to kind of look at. Oh, nationalism. He definitely fits this one. He is ultra-nationalistic, and nationalism I shouldn't need to explain, so I'm not really going to focus too much on, but we have to understand that Napoleon really brought nationalism into all these places, and each time there's a revolt, there is this nationalistic push. And there is a desire for Germany to have some sort of unification, as we'll talk about when we get to the actual map. Oh, pragmatism. The other term we're going to see is realpolitik for this. So Bismarck is what we call pragmatic, meaning he does not let his ideology, which was conservatism, prevent him from doing things that are liberal in hopes of achieving one nation. And he does this time and time again. And we'll talk about this, where he promotes a social policy, something like healthcare, which he does in the 1870s, something like old age pension programs. Those are things that he didn't particularly like, but he promotes them anyway to maintain control, to maintain power, and to keep unity. And so that's something I think we have to understand with Bismarck, is that to achieve his goal, which is that one nation at first, he's going to do anything to do that. To maintain that one nation, he is, again, going to be pragmatic. He's not going to stick to an ideology. He's going to adapt to the situation. And that's really what realpolitik is. But let's get to the real juice of it all. Whoa. So here's your map of Germany. Now, let's a couple things first. Going into all of this, there are 39 German states. Now, who actually dominates this? Two. And those two are, of course, Prussia, as you see here in the blue, and they are pretty big, and they're also over here. and of course Austria, who controls large amounts of territory. And of course, Austria has more than just Germany. They also have Austria-Hungary, and they have parts of Eastern Europe. And of course, you could also say Prussia also has parts of Poland, etc., etc. And so these are the two dominating powers in Germany. Now, there had been some, not unification, but there had been like a conglomerate. There had been some economic ties. There had been a confederation where they got together. They're even going to have a little assembly where all the German states do certain things and try and appeal to each other. And for the most part, Austria had dominated these things since the Napoleonic Wars. Remember, we had Metternich, right? And this is a politician for Austria who completely dominated political thought. Oh, there he is, Otto von Bismarck. Tell you what, he is an interesting guy, and he, rules from 1815. Or not rules, but he lives from 1815 to 1898. Now, this is not a guy, this isn't a rags to riches story. This is a junker. He is a noble. Now, Prussian nobility is a little odd, because Prussian nobles worked their land at this time, and a lot of them did do farming. And Bismarck, to his credit, in his early years, in his 20s, is going to be a very avid farmer. He's going to do a lot of research. He is a crazy reader. One thing about Bismarck that should be known, he kind of reminds me of a guy like Teddy Roosevelt in this situation, where he reads all the time. And when he has a problem, he just reads until he figures out how to solve it. And that's one of the things that he always did. He was very well informed about everything, and he read a lot. He read English literature, he read Spanish literature, he read German literature, he even read some stuff that was coming out of France. And so he is just very well rounded. And that made him so very effective as a diplomat because he was able to relate to people, he was able to talk to people about things. And so here you have this guy from this conservative junker family who's going to marry a fairly wealthy woman, which is going to help him out in life. And he is going to have this goal to unify Germany. And one of the things that he's going to really coin is that realpolitik. And this is that word, if you guys were in like AP or whatever, they would really kind of focus in on that, but I like you to know it because it is kind of important. Realpolitik is very simple to remember, same as pragmatic. He doesn't hold himself to an ideology, right? Realpolitik means I'm going to solve the problem, and it doesn't matter if it crosses over my beliefs, I'm going to fix the problem that way. That's as best as I can really put it. And so that's what realpolitik is. These are pragmatic politicians who look at an issue and they say, well, I may not agree with that, but I'm going to do it to preserve the country or to help out the state. And a great example of this is kind of interesting. Bismarck looked at, later in life at least, universal suffrage, universal voting. He said, and I quote this, he said that universal voting is not something for liberals. In fact, it's a conservative stance because by giving universal voting rights, you are in turn giving the people something to appreciate you by and therefore controlling them. And that's insane when you really think about it, right? To have that kind of a mindset. But he did. This guy's going to rule Germany for 20 years after they become independent. Let's keep in mind the first 10 years of his political life are going to be getting Germany to that point. So Otto von Bismarck, and we're going to be talking about him a whole lot throughout this time, and really he is the center figure. He is the main guy in this lesson, just like Cavour was for Italy. Bismarck and the liberals. So Bismarck actually said that he was liberal in his youth. This is something that has come forth a lot later in his life that he says this. It's actually hard to find very much evidence of him being actually liberal in his youth, but I guess we can go with that. Sure, he was liberal. Here's the thing. Bismarck was terrible at college. He didn't go to class very often. He had a bit of a problem when it came to drinking at times. He womanized a lot, but he still read. He did all the reading he needed to do, and he would actually go in and then ace his exams after not showing up for 3 months, and it really aggravated a lot of the people he was around. Bismarck also had a harsh temper. He got into duels quite often, and so he did get in a series of duels for people challenging his honor and things to that nature. And so Bismarck has this kind of rocky road. Someone like this is not going to be groomed to run a state, and that's what's kind of funny about him. He really wasn't in that position. It's not until 1847 that a little bit of chance gets him into that situation. So in 1847, you have Bismarck, and basically he gets invited to be in this parliament. King Frederick Wilhelm had called a parliament in Prussia. Now, Prussia didn't have a parliament. They didn't have voting and all those other things. But because of all the turmoil taking place in Europe and in Prussia because of a slow industrialization process, there was a call for said parliament. And Bismarck comes. Now, he comes to this parliament, and he is not very well known. He is a young guy, young politician. And it's funny because you have a lot of liberals there, because liberalism was one of the predominant uh, things that's going on. And these liberals begin to say essentially that uh, the only reason the Prussian people overthrew Napoleon in 1813 was because they were promised a constitution. And so Bismarck, of course, gets up and gives a speech. And he blasts this idea. And he says there was no sheet of paper that caused people to rebel against Napoleon. It was because of their love of the state, their love of Prussia. And he understands that this stance is going to be so very unpopular. And the hall erupts and everyone starts to boo Bismarck. And in this classic kind of just stuck up political fashion, Bismarck sits down as they're booing him and jeering him, and he opens up a newspaper and ignores them. Some people said behind that newspaper you could see a little chuckle, but he just opened up a newspaper and ignored them. And it is through this that his political mindset becomes known. He doesn't like Parliament. He's never going to like Parliament. But he's going to manipulate them. He knew that was the reaction. And when it calmed down, he finished his speech. And he knew that's exactly what he was going to get. And guess what? Newspapers who were there are going to report on it. And his name all of a sudden gets put forward to the king, right? Well, he goes home, and we get the revolutions of 1848. Now, in the revolutions of 1848, we saw liberals revolt in the streets. Bismarck wants to fight against this, but he really can't, and he kind of has to wait it out. And it's at this point where he starts to really gain an interest in politics, because he's actually very fearful. He feels like the monarchy doesn't do enough in 1848 to put it down. But he also looks at the liberal revolts and he says this was a failure. And in fact, in 1848 in Prussia, conservatives win out, and we see a conservative consensus kind of start to draw. The only real compromise is going to be that there's going to be sort of a parliament, but sort of not a parliament. In Prussia is going to do this parliamentary dance throughout the 1850s. So as that parliament does get established, Bismarck eventually goes, and he's actually going to be sent off as a diplomat. Actually, Frederick Wilhelm didn't like him too much, and largely because he was very outspoken and very much, kind of a jerk to people at times. And so they sent him to Russia, which sounds terrible, but it's actually kind of an interesting scenario. In Russia, he meets a lot of people, and he realizes that Russia is not that much different from Prussia at this time. They're slowly going through the modern age and everything else. But the other thing is he starts to grow relationships with some of the Russian diplomats. And that's going to help him out later on, because Russia is going to be one of the key allies that Bismarck is going to create. And you got to remember, Bismarck is in Russia during the Crimean War. And so because of that, Bismarck kind of has an inside look into what Russia's feeling like. And that's why Prussia and Russia are actually going to have a little bit of an alliance going on post-Crimean War, even though Prussia never helped them out. He also gets sent to France. He gets sent to France in the later part of this. And in France, he meets a lot of different people in France. He actually meets Napoleon III once, not really personally meets him, but kind of in the same room, starts to get a beat on him, starts to understand how the French politics work, because it is very kind of backwards. And remember, France just had this huge republic, and so he starts to see that. But France is also modernized, very industrialized. He also goes to Britain throughout this time period. He'll visit the Netherlands, and he sees how Europe is kind of running. And that brings him back to Prussia eventually in the late 1850s, where he starts to try and promote programs that will do industrialization, which the king is sort of doing, but it won't be fully implemented until the 1860s. Oh, the real fun one is Bismarck gets sent to the German Confederation, right? So they had this big German diet, and there's actually a couple different things happen. Frederick Wilhelm's offered the crown and turns it down, and Bismarck wants him to turn it down as well because he knew that people wouldn't like this. So the German Confederation and the German diet was often run by the Austrians, and they had a really weird, archaic rule in this, and I want you to, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine, but they had a rule of this where there was no smoking in the diet. No one could smoke except the Austrian diplomats. And so Austria could smoke. And so the second day of the deliberation, Bismarck's sitting next to the Austrian diplomat. The Austrian diplomat pulls out a cigar, lights it up. Then Bismarck looks and pulls out a cigar and lights it up, and the guy almost falls out of his chair. They flip out. How could you do this? And he says, what? You're smoking, I'm smoking, we're equal. And that's a huge thing. This almost causes a mini war. Austria is very insulted, apologies, and Bismarck's going to get sent back to Russia for this. But it very much shows you exactly what he's thinking. He understands how to push people's buttons, and he starts to figure out what Austria is really about. And it is also at this conference that he understands there are two parts of German unification. There's an Austrian-centered version and a Prussian-centered version. They do not mix. One of these countries will lose dominance, and he knows this. And so he really pleads with the king to help him kind of establish this because he does not want Prussia to lose authority. And one of the things he tells Wilhelm is, you can't support this stuff that's happening in this German Congress because if you do, you're going to lose your sovereignty. You're going to lose your ability to run yourself. And Austria, of course, is going to have this big problem. Now, it's also kind of funny because Bismarck, at this very assembly, kind of negotiates Austria out of an economic agreement because of the Crimean War, because they didn't help out Russia, which makes Russia happy. You see where this is going. It's a lot of twists and turns, okay? And you don't need to know them all, but it's just kind of the nuances of it all. But Bismarck is going to luck out because all of a sudden there's a couple of deaths in the crown and we get Wilhelm. He'll be known as Wilhelm I when Germany is established. And he becomes king in 1861. He names Bismarck his Chancellor of Government. Now, why? Well, everybody kept quitting. Parliament was too hard to control. It really didn't work. And so Bismarck's going to take control. And one of his first acts in this new position, one of his first acts is to give a speech that will be known as the Blood and Iron speech. The Blood and Iron speech. And it is kind of an interesting, it's very much an interesting speech in the sense that Bismarck kind of outlines what he wants to do, but he also kind of states a bunch of different things. And he really bashes liberalism. And so let me read you a little excerpt from it. Germany is not looking to Prussia's liberalism, but its power. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden may indulge liberalism. For that reason, no one will assign them Prussia's role. Prussia has to concentrate its power for the opportune moment, which has already been missed several times. Prussia's borders, according to the Vienna treaties, are not favorable for a healthy, vital state. It is not by speeches and majority resolutions that the great questions of the times are decided. That was the big mistake of 1848 and 1849. No, these problems are solved by blood and iron, right? And so what's interesting is, first off, there's no actual recording of this speech. There's no real documentation. It was kind of hand-scribed, and then we've got multiple interpretations. So some of the words that I read to you might be backwards based off of the source that I read it from. Either way, blood and iron. Now, what does blood and iron mean? Well, it's a two-pronged approach. Iron meaning industrialization, blood meaning war. And that is going to be this big thing. Now, by the way, Wilhelm freaks out. He is like, what are you doing, right? What the hell, man? And he freaks out, and he immediately goes to Bismarck, and he's like, dude, you're going to get us killed. You're talking about all this stuff, and you're talking about war and all this stuff. They're going to execute us. He's like, we're gonna die because of you. And Bismarck's like, look, dude, calm down, Wilhelm. This is their relationship, by the way, for the next 30 years. He's like, calm it down, man. We're not gonna die. We're not gonna get killed. And he's like, no, we're gonna die. And then he looks at Wilhelm, and as the story goes, according to Bismarck at least, he kind of stiffens up and he says, well, you know what? If you die defending your right as king, then that's a noble death. And if you're not noble enough to do that, then why are you king? And at that point, Bismarck says, Wilhelm stiffens up and says, you're right. It's my duty to serve the Prussian people. And as a king and a Prussian soldier, I have to fight for this right. And that's how he convinces Wilhelm to do this stuff. And he does this all the time. He manipulates the guy. And so Wilhelm backs Bismarck. And it's so funny because in Parliament, they thought the liberals think Bismarck is the arch conservative. He is the far, far right. And the conservatives think Bismarck is far too liberal. Realistically, he plays both sides against each other. He actually keeps the controversy going. He maintains an unbalance in Parliament because it keeps him in power, because it appears that he's the only one who can control Parliament. So his political philosophy is realpolitik, as I've said before. I really want you to know this and understand it. He uses conservatism and liberalism and the fights between them to his advantage. Now, he is very loyal to the state. Is he loyal to the king? I think so as well, but definitely loyal to the state. The king probably falls just under the state. And so he is very, very loyal to that. And that kind of makes him conservative. But at the same time, he's going to do things that consolidate. He convinces Wilhelm to give universal male suffrage. Not because he believes it's a good thing. Like I said earlier, he does this believing it's manipulative. They can control the people if they do that. Give them limited choices, much like Napoleon did back in the day. And so he really promotes nationalism and unity. One of the things that he does in 1861 is they revamp the military and they start to really invest heavily in trains. And they're going to build locomotive tracks all over Prussia. They're actually going to invest all over northern Germany. They're going to even link up in Bavaria with a rail line. And so they try and unite Germany economically, and that's going to take place over 10 years. The military upgrade is so very important because they reassess how their military operates. And we're going to see that really come into fruition in the next couple of years. The military, and the Prussian military was always one of the best, but they've redone the technology. They are redoing how they fight, and that's going to be something that's very remarkable. And here we go. War to unite Germany. Bismarck is going to have a plan. This is not something that is not, like, this isn't random. What he does is not random. Italian unification, some of the stuff happened by coincidence. This is not coincidental. This is him planning things out. And as we'll see, he's going to play countries off each other. He's going to build alliances, and let's just get it going. So 3 years into power, our first war is actually going to take place against Denmark. Why? Because it's Denmark. So we have a bunch of things that are going on here. One, Denmark had a king die. And so the king died in Denmark, and that caused this huge power struggle. And you actually had the heir to the Danish throne. You had a part German person who was very pro-German and would help out German peoples. And then you had someone who was anti-German, almost nationalistic. And the anti-German Dane took power. And Denmark had owned these territories called Schleswig-Holstein, right? There's German-speaking people there. Almost 80% of the people there are German, and they begin to pass laws that kind of restrict their rights. And this is the perfect scenario for Bismarck. Now, here's the deal. Bismarck can't just go to war because since the concert of Europe, every time someone goes to war and tries to expand territory, everyone gets involved. However, Bismarck, in the years prior to this, had already made a deal with Russia, where him and the Russians saw eye to eye. They were lining up a marriage between the two families. And so they made a deal with Russia to kind of stay out of their way. And Russia actually has kind of a mutual defense agreement with them. He also had good relations with the French. And the other thing is we have to remember, Napoleon III of France is a romantic. And if he spins this war the right way, if it doesn't look like it's their fault, then Napoleon's not going to help. And then Austria comes in, and he uses Austria in this war. And he actually appeals to Austria and says, hey, this is Germany, right? this is a German issue. We need to help Germans because Germans are being discriminated against, so help us out. And so Austria is going to go in and they're going to help out the Prussians. And so they declare war on Denmark. It's a quick war. It is over very quickly. The Prussians dominate the field. They do realize they need to reassess how they're fighting because the way the rifles are working now, they can't just march Napoleonically. And so they change their tactics into small groupings, mobile artillery, and things of that nature. Now, here's where this gets kind of fun. So after they liberate Schleswig and Holstein, they could do a couple things. They could just let them become an independent country. Makes sense. Like, there's 39 independent German countries. Why not have 41 or 40? Or they could keep it. And if you're Prussia, you can keep all of it, but then you look like the bad guy, right? So if you keep all of it, you look bad. So when they're negotiating, and it's just Austria and Prussia negotiating, Bismarck says to Austria, we want to keep everything. And then Austria's like, oh, you can't keep everything. Why would you want to let you do that? How about we keep half, you keep half? And that's what he wanted to begin with. He just wanted half. But now all of a sudden, it makes Austria look like they're in it too. And so there's two countries doing this. They're dividing up territory. It keeps France happy. It keeps Britain happy. Denmark's probably not happy, but that's what they do, right? And so they divide it up. Austria's going to get the south. Prussia's going to get the north. Here's where this gets even better. Almost immediately after this war is over, Bismarck begins to just completely bash Austria. They release a series of press things from him that he had released personally, where he's just making fun of the Austrians militarily. Every blunder they had militarily, they make fun of. They make fun of the fact that Holstein is ripe for revolution because Austria doesn't know how to control its own people. And they continue to insult the Austrians over and over and over again. And of course, this is going to really aggravate the Austrian leadership because this is an insult to national pride. This is an insult to their country. Remember, Austria believes it's the dominant German state. And now here's Prussia insulting you publicly, trying to rally support against you. They've kicked you out of an economic league. You helped them fight a war, and now all they do is insult you. And quite frankly, Austria gets a little fed up with it. And so just 2 years later, in 1866, we see this problem develop. And it starts off, at first, Wilhelm and Austria are kind of working things out. Wilhelm is kind of, doesn't really want to go to war. He even tells Bismarck, stop, don't you dare go to war with Austria. And Bismarck's like, hey, but do you see what Austria's saying about you? They're saying you're a coward. They're saying that you can't do these things. And then Wilhelm's like, are you serious? And he starts to kind of manipulate that fact. But Austria becomes so incensed by the things they're doing. And then when Prussia decides to back Italy, who is really vying for independence at this point. Remember, Italy had become independent 6 years ago, but now they're trying to expand in other territory like Venice, right? Venice belonged to Austria. And so when Bismarck and Italy start to get along, all of a sudden Austria is going to declare war on Prussia. So if you're Bismarck, this is the perfect scenario. They declared war on you. It's not your fault. It's their fault. He goes immediately to France and says, they declared war on us. We can deal with this, but we just need reassurance that you're not going to get involved. And France, Napoleon III says, okay, that's fine. And then he even tells him, we're helping Italy get this territory. Napoleon's like, good, we helped Italy too. And so there you have it, right? And so they go to war. And it's northern Germany versus southern Germany, almost Protestants versus Catholics in some ways. And really, this should have been a long war. Like, a lot of people think this is going to be an elongated thing. That's why France isn't that worried. Yeah, destabilize these two places. That's fine with France. Except it wasn't long. It was over in less than a month. Why? Well, Germany are using bolt-action rifles that have 4 shots loaded in. Austria is still using muzzle-loading rifles. That's a huge difference. Germany's military was divided up into squads that did quick movements. They were able to rail in soldiers using the trains. Their train system was far better equipped for this type of war, and they're able to bring people in, and reinforce. And this, of course, made them a military machine, and they just sweep on in. The general who does this is Helmut von Moltke, right? This is the big Prussian general. He revamped the Prussian military. Him and Bismarck see eye to eye on this, and he has changed how war is going to be. That idea of like a blitz, right? Now this is like a blitz without planes, where you use quick moving army groups. Think like Sherman's march in some ways in the American Civil War. Just quick movements using smaller bands of soldiers. Don't need the big battle. Get the smaller battles out the way. And that's what it is, quick moving artillery. And they overwhelmed the Austrian soldiers. They beat them in battle after battle after battle. And by the way, the northern German states consolidated into one kind of northern German confederation. And this is also uniting that. And then some of those southern German states after the war look at Austria and they say, you're no longer the power, Prussia is, and they begin to unite with the Prussians economically as a result. And so this is a huge loss for Austria. This is kind of the downfall of their country. You really see them just completely fall off the map after this. And obviously in World War I, that's when they disband. But this is a huge deal. And for the Prussians, they're coming closer to that goal. But there's still a lot of people who don't want this to happen. Russia starts to kind of peek its head up. And same with France. They're like, whoa, wait a second. You guys need to calm down. And so Wilhelm and Bismarck get in a fight because Bismarck's like, look, Wilhelm, you can't keep going into Austria. You can't take any of their territory. We got to leave now and just consolidate what we have in Germany. And Wilhelm's like, well, why can't we just take it over? And they're like, because then everyone else is going to attack us. And so Wilhelm decides to back off with that. But Austria does a couple things where they essentially sign a non-aggression agreement after this. They're going to decrease their military, and they become a second-tier power. And so now we have Prussian dominance of the German states, 66 to 1870. And so Prussia begins to revamp its military. This has been kind of practice, right? Beating Austria, beating Denmark. They begin to see where their military was strong, where it wasn't strong, how cavalry can be used with repeating rifles. Those things kind of change warfare a little bit. More accurate artillery and everything else. And so, boom, we're going to get another war because the one country that wants to prevent them from unifying, again, is going to be France. And it is so very interesting how this breaks out. Bismarck had a good relationship with France, and so did Wilhelm. Granted, Napoleon didn't quite trust Bismarck. He did trust Wilhelm, though. And so Bismarck, what he's going to have to do is get Napoleon mad enough at Wilhelm so that Napoleon will declare war. Bismarck can't declare war on France. If he does, Russia's going to get involved. However, if France declares war on Bismarck, Russia, by a contract, by an alliance, won't get involved. And Britain, under Bismarck's assumption, is just going to watch anyway, as long as they don't try and take over France. The ruler of France is Napoleon III. Napoleon III, a so-called liberal, but really conservative, much like his uncle. He's a romantic, okay? He idolizes his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte, and he really wants to be just like him. And so, he wants to go into war, just like, the Crimean War. Why was France involved in that? Well, because Napoleon III wanted to be involved in that, right? Let's get back at Russia for beating my uncle. Why does he get involved with Italy? Because he's defeating the Austrians, and obviously, Napoleon hated the Austrians, so it makes sense. And the question is, why does he ever declare war on Prussia to begin with? Well, it's absolutely insane. So here's how this is going to go. The Spanish crown comes up for grabs because there's a revolution in Spain. Queen leaves. What the hell is going to happen, right? And so the Spanish crown's up for grabs. And there's a German prince who's nominated because he's got some tie to the bloodline. This sort of backed by Prussia, at least we think they are. We don't quite know, but we assume Bismarck kind of backs him. Napoleon flips out, says, no, this can't happen. They can't do that. And so they demand that they rescind that recommendation. And this causes a little bit of bitterness, especially in newspapers where Germans are like, what, why can't a German rule that? Habsburgs have ruled everywhere else. Why can't we put a German in charge? And Napoleon wants to back a classical ruler instead, and then so insults get exchanged. But still, Wilhelm and Bismarck don't see eye to eye on this. Wilhelm wants to avoid war with France, and so he begins to write telegraphs back and forth to Napoleon. Now, Napoleon demands a national apology, and Wilhelm is kind of lukewarm on this idea. And Bismarck, of course, is going to say, a national apology? He's trying to embarrass you, man. Like, he is trying to embarrass you. don't do this. And so, Wilhelm goes back and forth on this. And then finally, Wilhelm starts to send some telegraphs back, but Bismarck begins to edit those telegraphs. And by editing those telegraphs, he made the language slightly more insulting to Napoleon. Napoleon became very incensed by this and declared war on Prussia. So yeah, he declares war on Prussia because of an incident happening in Spain that Bismarck is nominating someone who was probably never going to get it, and so he declares war. Now, because they declared war, Russia won't get involved, and Bismarck now has his chance, right? And because he is declaring war on the German states because of a German nomination for king, this unites a lot of the German city-states, a lot of them. They raise an army of over 1 million soldiers, which at this point in time was unheard of. And of course, they're going to train them all in using Prussian trains, and they're going to be led by Prussian military, same military generals that led the war 4 years ago. And Napoleon, the French army is pretty good, right? And of course, Napoleon's going to ride out there because much like his uncle, he's a military leader. Thing is, Napoleon III does not have any of the military ability that his uncle had. This isn't going to go well. So a war that should have lasted years lasted less than 6 months. July 1870 to January 1871. Most of that's not even fighting. In the beginning of the war, our boy Napoleon III, pictured here, is going to be captured in a battle, and he is going to abdicate the throne. A French Republic is declared, and Paris will be sieged for 1 month before it finally surrenders. The official peace treaty will be done in January. Germany overwhelmed France. They mobilized soldiers. They came through Belgium, which really threw off the French. They weren't expecting to come through Belgium. They were bocking down on that southern border they have with Germany, or the German southern border there, central. And it really kind of surprised them. And the quick movements of the German army, their ability to move soldiers that quickly, really surprised the French. They weren't able to do that. And so Germany becomes unified because of this. They become one country, and that's a huge deal. And the French Republic is going to be declared. France is going to, no more Napoleon. Sorry, dude, you go into exile. And the French Republic, they write their 5th constitution, and all of a sudden, look at that. They got it. And it's going to last. That French constitution will be in place until a little event in 1940. And then Germany also gets new territory, the Alsace-Lorraine territory, which is territory in France. And the guy who orchestrated it all is this man, Otto von Bismarck. This is obviously his finest hour. This is one of my favorite paintings. It's by Anton von Werner. And it is the unification of Germany, and they are in Versailles. They do this in Versailles, and the German princes all come in and they declare a unified Germany to the new king of Germany, the emperor, who will be Wilhelm I. If you know anything about paintings, and we've talked about them enough to where you should, the main focus of a painting is where? Generally the middle. What catches your eye in the middle? Probably this guy, whose name is Otto von Bismarck. And we look at the saluting swords. Oh, where are they? They stop at Bismarck. We look at some of these faces in the crowd, and they look here. They look at Bismarck, their hats tilted towards Bismarck. The painter is saying, yes, Wilhelm is king, but he rules Germany. And that's the reality. Bismarck will control Germany. And the new German state is there. And Bismarck will spend the next 20 years as chancellor. His real politique will lead him to advocate for continental peace. He will be fighting for peace continentally. Now, locally, inside of his own country, he is going to do a series of reforms. One is the culture Kampf. Oh, God, that's really bad. He goes against the Catholic Church. He tries to get them out of schools, tries to get rid of all privileges of the church. He gets condemned by Pope Pius. They fight publicly. It just gets really messy. And he kind of goes back on a lot of that stuff and realizes I can't really go after people's religions. Not to mention southern Germany could have just rebelled, Bavaria in particular. So he starts to reinstitute some other things. And like I said, voting, right? Let's have some voting. Sure. Let's have Social Security, essentially, right? So an old age pension fund. Now, why? Because you give them that, they're going to continue to vote for you. That's part of the thought process. Healthcare. You give the people healthcare, and then Germany has one of the first universal healthcare programs, and they do it in the 1870s, and they did it because it helps control the populace. Public schooling all throughout Germany, well, that existed in a lot of places. The public schooling aspect promoted loyalty to the state, promoted nationalism, and promoted military service. Again, things that help him out. And so Bismarck's going to be a highly effective leader. Let's put it like this. Germany's economy is going to be number 3 in the world by 1900. Now, I'll leave you on this. I will leave you on this. Bismarck, as he sees Europeans descending into imperialism. Imperialism is the takeover of Africa and this arms race that takes place. All the countries after this happens obviously freak out over Bismarck, freak out over Germany. They begin to build their militaries. And he predicts that a war will break out. He says it's not going to break out in France or in Germany. It's going to break out in some random place in the Balkans. And he's dead right. That's where it's going to happen. That's where World War I is going to happen. And then the other thing that he does that's so very important is when Bismarck does retire, and Bismarck is going to be forced out, right? He's going to be forced out in 1890 to 91. He gets forced out right around there by Wilhelm II, the next in line to the throne after his buddy Wilhelm I dies. Now Wilhelm II doesn't like him. His mommy didn't like him. Said he used Wilhelm I, and so he gets him out of power. And there's an interesting point. Bismarck in 1898 tells this new king, and he says, with the way things are going, if you do not change, there will be a global catastrophe, a global war in the next 20 years. And the Germany as we know it will be gone in 20 years. And that's what he tells them. You know what year that was? It was 1898. Germany lost World War I in 1918. Well, you guys have an assignment on Teams. Please complete it. And hope you enjoyed today's lesson about Bismarck, the realpolitik, the Bond villain who wins.